There is a detail in this passage that most readers treat as a piece of set decoration. Pilate writes an inscription and places it on the cross. It says Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. The text notes that it was written in Aramaic, Latin, and Greek. That looks like a practical NAZARETH languages to cover the multilingual crowd at Passover. But the detail does not function as a practicality in John's telling. It functions as a collision, because each language says something the other languages cannot say, and each audience hears something the other audiences do not hear. Pilate writes it himself, the text says. He does not delegate this to a scribe, and when the chief priests object, he refuses to change a single word. That refusal is not stubbornness. It is a theological statement being made through a political act, and John wants the reader to feel the weight of every language pressed against the others. Start with Aramaic. Aramaic was the language of the streets, the language Jesus spoke, the language of the common people who had hailed him as king just days before. When a speaker of Aramaic read that sign, they did not read it as a foreign imposition. They read it in their own tongue, with all the resonances of Scripture that came with the word king. The Aramaic word for king, Malka, carried the weight of the messianic hopeth king who would come to restore Israel. The sign in Aramaic was not merely identifying the condemned man. It was declaring, in the language of the people, that this crucified man was the one they had been waiting for. And the people reading it would have felt the brutal irony their king, hanging on a Roman cross, with a charge sheet that named him exactly as they had hoped, but in a context of utter defeat. That is the first layer of the inscription, a direct address to the Jewish people, in their own language, naming their king in the moment of his most profound humiliation. But Latin was the language of the occupying power. Every Roman soldier who passed that cross read the inscription in Latin, and for them the word rex carried no messianic weight at all. It was a criminal charge. Rex Eudorumking of the Jews was Pilate's mockery of Jewish aspirations, a sneer at a people who thought they could have a king while Rome ruled. In Latin, the inscription was a piece of propaganda, a public humiliation designed to tell every Jew who saw it this is what happens to anyone who claims kingship against Caesar. The Roman soldiers would have understood it as a cruel joke, a way to twist the knife one last time. Pilate, by writing it himself, was making sure the joke landed exactly as he intended. He was not informing the public about the charge. He was using the charge to humiliate the entire Jewish nation through the body of one man. Then there is Greek. Greek was the language of the educated elite, the language of the diaspora, the language of trade and philosophy. It was also the language in which John writes his gospel. The Greek phrase ho basilius ton ioudein carries a double meaning that the other languages cannot fully replicate. In Greek, basilius is the word for king, but in the Septuagint it is the word used for God as king, for the promised Davidic king, for the sovereign ruler of Israel. A Greek-speaking Jew reading that inscription would have heard the same echo that the Aramaic speaker heard, but with an additional layer. The Greek word can function as a title of divine authority, not merely political rule. Pilate had no intention of invoking the Septuagint, but John intends the reader to hear it. The sign says exactly what John has been telling the reader all along: this man is the king, the true king, the one whose throne is a cross. The Greek language makes the claim unavoidable for anyone literate in the scriptures. Now here is the problem the text creates. Pilate, a Roman governor who has spent the entire trial trying to release Jesus, suddenly writes an inscription that the chief priests find deeply offensive. Why does Pilate care? He has already handed Jesus over to be crucified. He could have written anything. He could have written Jesus of Nazareth, charged with sedition. He could have written nothing at all. Instead, he writes a title that the priests immediately recognize as a claim they cannot accept. And when they ask him to change it to he said he was king of the Jews, Pilate refuses. What I have written, I have written. The Greek there is ho gegrapha, gegrapheth perfect tense, indicating an action completed with ongoing results. This is not a temporary scribble. This is a permanent declaration. Pilate, for reasons the text does not fully explain, has decided that this inscription will stand. The irony is staggering. The man who spent the whole trial searching for a loophole, who argued with the crowd, who washed his hands, who tried to avoid responsibility, this same man suddenly becomes immovable on a piece of wording. He will not compromise on the sign. He will not negotiate. The priests, who had all the leverage throughout the trial, now find themselves powerless against a Roman governor who will not budge on a detail that seems trivial. And yet it is not trivial. The inscription is the only thing in the entire Passion narrative that Pilate controls completely, and he uses that control to say exactly what he wants to say, which means the viewer has to ask, what is Pilate trying to say? He is not confessing faith. Nothing in the text suggests Pilate believes Jesus is the King of the Jews in any theological sense. He is making a political statement, and the politics are aimed directly at the chief priests. The priests wanted Jesus dead because they feared he would provoke Roman retaliation and destabilize their arrangement with the empire. Pilate knows this. And so by writing King of the Jews and refusing to change it, Pilate is telling the priests you wanted him dead because of this title. So I am going to put that title on his cross where every passerby will see it. I am going to make sure that the very claim you tried to suppress is what identifies him in his death. It is a petty, vindictive gesture. Pilate is not honoring Jesus. He is mocking the priests. But John does not let the reader stay with Pilate's motive. The gospel has been building for 19 chapters toward the moment when Jesus is lifted up. And the phrase lifted up has carried double meaning throughout lifted up on the cross and lifted up in glory. Now in the inscription, John gives the reader another double meaning. Pilate writes the words for his own reasons. The priests read the words and hear a political insult. The Roman soldiers read the words and laugh at Jewish pretensions. The Aramaic-speaking crowd reads the words and weeps for their crucified king. But the reader of the gospel, the one who has been watching from the beginning, hears something else entirely. The reader hears the truth that every character in the scene refuses to speak aloud. The man on the cross is exactly who the sign says he is. He is the king, not because Pilate says so, but because God has written the same title in a language no human inscription can reach. And that is the tension that the text will not let go of. The inscription is physically real. It is there on the cross in 3 languages for everyone to read. But every group reads it differently because every group brings a different set of assumptions. The priests read it and see blasphemy. The Romans read it and see a joke. The people read it and see tragedy. Only the gospel reader is positioned to read it and see the coronation of a king whose kingdom is not of this world. The problem is that the reader is also part of the crowd. The reader brings assumptions too. Every person watching this scene is making a decision about which language they are going to hear the sign in: the language of power, the language of rejection, or the language of faith. So the question that hangs at the end of this part is not about Pilate. It is not about the priests. It is about the viewer. When you read the inscription, what do you hear? The perfect tense of what God has written remains the same. What changes is the ear that hears it, and the priests are about to demand that the sign be rewritten because they cannot bear what the sign actually says. That demand is not ancient history. It is the reflex of every person who has ever wanted to edit the claims of Jesus into something more comfortable. The priests want a crucifixion without a crown. They want a dead troublemaker, not a king, and the sign refuses to give them that. It stands immovable in 3 languages, saying exactly what it says. The priests come to Pilate, and they make a request that sounds reasonable. Do not write the King of the Jews, they say. Write instead that this man said, I am King of the Jews. It is a subtle change, but a devastating one. They are not asking Pilate to remove the title entirely. They are asking him to turn the inscription from a declaration into a quotation, from a statement of fact into a report of a claim. The difference is the difference between a coronation and a courtroom. If the sign said he was king, then the power of the statement collapses into the words of a condemned criminal. It becomes a piece of evidence, not a proclamation. Anyone reading it would shrug and move on. Another messianic pretender, another failed rebellion, another sad footnote. But Pilate refuses. What I have written, I have written. The perfect tense in Greek, gegrapha, does not merely mean I wrote it and it stays. It means I wrote it and it remains written with ongoing force, and no one can unwrite it. The verb is in the perfect tense because the action is complete and the result continues into the present. Pilate is not being stubborn for stubbornness' sake. He is making a theological point he does not fully understand. The priests wanted the title qualified. They wanted it framed as a lie that Jesus told, not a truth that Pilate declared. But Pilate will not qualify it, and John wants the reader to see that the refusal is part of a larger pattern. Throughout the Gospel, Jesus has been the one who says, "I am," without qualification. 7 times he uses that phrase with a predicate: "I am the bread of life. I am the light of the world. I am the resurrection and the life." Each time, the religious leaders heard blasphemy. Now, on the cross, a pagan governor writes the ultimate "I am" claim without even meaning to. "The King of the Jews." No if, no maybe, no, he said. Just the bare assertion. And the priests cannot change it. The same power that crucified Jesus now declares his kingship in the most public way possible. And the very people who orchestrated his death have no authority to edit the sign. That is the irony that sits at the center of this scene. The priests spent the entire trial trying to control the narrative. They manipulated the crowd. They pressured Pilate. They secured the death sentence. And now, in the moment of their victory, they discover that the story is no longer theirs to control. The sign stands, and every language every person sees tells the same truth about the man on the middle cross. The Greek word basileus echoes the Septuagint's royal theology. The Latin rex mocks their hopes but speaks louder than their denial. The Aramaic malchor reaches into the deepest hope of their people, and none of it can be taken back. The priests have succeeded in killing the king, but they cannot succeed in unkinging him. The sign remains, and here the present-day reader has to face something uncomfortable. The same instinct that drove the priests to ask for a revised inscription is alive in every person who has ever tried to make Jesus more manageable. The priests did not object to the crucifixion. They objected to the title. They wanted Jesus dead, yes, but they also wanted him dead without the claim to kingship. They wanted to dispose of the body without having to reckon with the identity. And that is exactly what many readers do with the gospel. The death is acceptable. The suffering is acceptable. The moral teaching is acceptable. But the kingship, the absolute, unqualified, all-encompassing claim that this man is Lord over every part of life, that is the part that people keep trying to rewrite. They want a Jesus who said he was king, not a Jesus who is king. A Jesus whose claims can be filed away under first-century Jewish apocalyptic, rather than a Jesus whose throne sits at the center of reality. The word gegraphate is written, and remains written, becomes then not just a historical detail, but a theological anchor. God has already written the truth about Jesus. The inscription on the cross, written by a pagan hand in 3 languages, is the earthly echo of a heavenly reality that no human editing can alter. The priests cannot revise it. Pilate cannot take it back. The centuries cannot erode it. The sign says exactly what the sign says. And what it says is that the man dying in public shame is the king. Not a would-be king. Not a man who claimed to be king. The king. And every attempt to qualify that claim, to domesticate it, to reduce it to a metaphor or a memory, is just another version of the priest's request. Please rewrite it. Make it less absolute. Let us have the death without the crown. But the sign does not change. And the most striking thing about the scene is that Pilate never explains why he refuses. The gospel does not give us his inner thoughts. He simply says, "Ho gegrapha," and walks away. The words stand alone. And that is exactly how the truth of Jesus stands, without explanation, without apology, without revision. It is not that Pilate believes the truth. It is that the truth uses Pilate anyway. The inscription is a prophecy spoken by a man who does not know he is prophesying. And that is the way God often works in John's gospel. Caiaphas prophesied that one man should die for the people, and John tells us he spoke more than he knew. Pilate writes a title that declares the truth, and he writes it in 3 languages to make sure nobody misses it. And he does it for his own petty reasons, and the truth still comes through. The 3 languages are not just a practical necessity. They are a theological statement about the scope of the kingship. Aramaic for the Jews, the people of the covenant. Latin for the Romans, the empire that rules the known world. Greek for the nations, the language of the diaspora and the Gentiles. The sign spans every major linguistic group present at that cross, and by extension it spans every power structure and every people group in the ancient world. There is no language left out. There is no audience excluded from the declaration. The king is for all of Themeven, the ones who reject him, even the ones who mock him, even the ones who crucify him. The inscription does not ask for their consent. It simply declares what is true. And that is the unresolved tension that the scene leaves the reader with. The sign stands. It is unchangeable. The king is declared, but the people who read the sign still have to decide what they will do with it. The priests read it and hate it. The Romans read it and mock it. The disciples, if they can bear to look, read it and weep. But the gospel reader is in a different position. The reader knows that the sign is true in a way none of the characters understand. The reader has been watching the whole story unfold, has heard Jesus say I am, has watched the signs and the discourses, has seen the glory hidden in the humiliation. And now the reader sees the sign, and the question is whether the reader will accept what the sign says or join the priests in trying to rewrite it. The sign cannot be rewritten. That is the point. The priests ask for a change and get a refusal. The centuries that follow will produce 1,000 attempts to rewrite the identity of Jesus, make him a moral teacher without the crown, a revolutionary without the cross, a spiritual guide without the exclusive claim to kingship. But the sign remains. Ho gegrapha, gegrapha. What is written is written. The perfect tense of God's declaration does not degrade with time. The three languages still speak, and every generation that encounters the gospel must decide whether they will hear the declaration or filter it through their own revisions. The final weight of this passage is not in Pilate's stubbornness. It is not in the priest's frustration. It is in the unchangeable nature of what God has written about Jesus. The inscription on the cross is a preview of the verdict that stands over all of history. This man is king, not because the church says so, not because the creeds say so, because God has said so, and what God has written, no human hand can erase. The priests cannot edit it. Pilate cannot unwrite it. The centuries cannot outlast it. The sign stands, and it stands for every language and every people, and it says exactly what it says. The only question is whether the person reading it will bow.